Hi guys, it's Angie with Fun Endeavors Tie-Dye Lab. Today I'm going to compare the difference between a hot water irrigation and an ice-dyed shirt. Both shirts have been washed and dried, soaked in a soda ash solution for 20 to 30 minutes. I wrung them out of my Panda spin dryer so they're just barely damp. I also have both of the shirts turned to inside out, and I'm using the same size and brand of shirt. I'm going to fold both of the shirts in a center oval burst, and for time's sake I'm only going to show how to fold one shirt. I'm starting the fold by centering the shirt, and this process is going to go really fast, but down below in the description for this video is a link to another video which shows how to center a shirt. Essentially what I'm doing is getting both sides of the front of the shirt next to each other and both sides of the back of the shirt next to each other. That way whenever I apply the dye, the front side is going to look more symmetrical, and so will the back. Now I'd like to find the center of the shirt. So to do that, I'm going to fold the bottom or the hem of the shirt up to the top of the shirt. Then using a washable marker, I'm going to place a mark right in the center of the shirt. I would actually like the burst area to start a little bit above center, so I'm placing another mark where I'd like to start that. Then using the washable marker and a piece of kite string, I'm going to draw half of an oval onto the shirt. I drew a second line for my reference, but I'm going to fan fold the first line that I drew. I wasn't entirely happy with the way the shirt ended at the very last fold, so I just opened it back up and I'm refolding that line. Once I have the line folded, I'm going to tie it with some kite string. I'm using kite string because later I'm going to incline dye these shirts, and so I don't want the sinew to stop the dye movement through the shirt. So kite string will hold all of my folds in place tight, but it won't stop the dye from moving or give the white lines in the shirt. Now I'm going to straighten the fan folds going out toward the end of the center of the burst and tie them with some kite string too. The rest of the shirt, I'm going to straighten the fan folds and tie it with the kite string. I folded both of the shirts the same way. However, since I didn't use any form of template or stencil to draw the burst onto the shirt, they're both just a little bit different in shape. Once I have the shirt tied, I'm going to set it aside for a day or so and allow it to dry out completely. I usually dye most of my shirts when they're dry, so I decided to go ahead and do that for this experiment as well. I get asked the question a lot, why do I usually dye my stuff dry? Well, it's kind of for a couple of reasons. I purchased a Panda spin dryer to spin out or wring out my shirts, and it does such a great job that they are truly just barely damp when I start to tie them. Since I usually tie quite a few shirts at one time, by the time I get around to applying the dye to them, they're normally dry or almost dry. I especially like to dry out larger folds like mandalas and geodes. I get better color saturation in the center of those folds if the shirt is dry when I start applying the dye. If I apply the dye to a geode or a mandala when it's still too damp in the middle, the fibers are already full of soda ash solution and they don't really want to soak up or get well saturated with the dye. However, if I allow them to dry out, they will wick up the dye very readily, just kind of like a dry sponge would do. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to incline dye both of these shirts. So I'm using the large plastic totes that I use when I liquid dye and the long metal racks that I usually liquid dye over. I've placed one end of the rack down inside of the tote, and I've stuck another small wire rack down at the bottom just so that it won't move or shift. I'm going to make myself an ice barrier and a barrier to help keep the dye onto the shirt, and to do that I'm using some silicone cake molds. I've wrapped the cake molds around the shirt, and I'm attaching wooden clothespins to the metal rack to hold the cake molds up close to the shirt. I have links down below this video in the description for where you can purchase the cake molds, the racks, and a lot of the other supplies that I use when I tie-dye. Here again, I'm showing the process for one shirt, but I did the same exact process for the other shirt as well. For this experiment, I'm using a variety of blues and purples that will give me some pretty good color splits. I've placed both of the containers side by side on my table so that I can apply the dye at the same time. The hot water irrigation shirt is the shirt on the left, and the ice-dyed shirt will be the shirt on the right. I'm beginning at the center burst portion of both of the shirts with Orchid from Dharma Trading Company. The next color is Sapphire Blue from Pro Chemical and Dye. For this experiment, I'm also testing how the shirts look if I leave a small white line in between each color. Obviously, I'm not applying exactly the same amount of dye to each portion of the shirt, but I'm doing my best to make them as close to each other as possible. Followed by Grape from Custom Colors. Ice Blue from Pro Chemical and Dye. Royal Purple from Grateful Dyes. Blueberry from Pro Chemical and Dye. The blueberry from Pro Chemical and Dye is new. I've never used this color before. I've used blueberry from Dharma Trading Company, but I haven't ever used the one from Pro Chemical and Dye. Lilac from Dharma Trading Company. Sky Blue from Grateful Dyes. Then I'm starting the colors over, beginning with Orchid, followed by Sapphire, lastly, I'm going to end with Grape. Now I'm going to put a generous sprinkle of dry soda ash over the top of both of the shirts. I'm still doing a modified version of the hot water irrigation where I'm soaking my shirt in soda ash before I tie it. Then I'm doing an additional sprinkle of soda ash over the top of the dye, but I'm not mixing the soda ash with the dye yet. I'm adding this additional soda ash to both of the shirts to make sure that after I force the additional water through the shirt, I still have plenty of soda ash in the shirt to react with the dye. Then to the shirt on the right, I'm going to add the ice and set it aside to allow the ice to melt. I use a sous vide one to prep the water for the hot water irrigation. I set it at 160 degrees, and once it reaches temperature, it keeps the water at 160 degrees for me until I'm ready to use it. I begin by placing a little bit of the hot water down inside of a spray bottle and gently mist the top of the shirt. I'm going to do the hot water irrigation process outside, and since it's really windy where I live, I want to gently mist the top of the shirt before I take it outside so that the dye doesn't blow around in the wind. Then I place the hot water down inside of a 2-gallon garden sprayer. I pump the sprayer up and then gently mist the top of the shirt. I mist it with water for a little while and then allow the water to soak in. I'm going to continue doing this until most of the dye is dissolved on top of the shirt and the dye has come through to the back side. By the time I actually start applying water to the top of the shirt, the water is someplace between 140 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. After most of the dye was dissolved, I removed the silicone cake molds and turned the shirt over to see if the dye was coming through to the back side. There was still quite a bit of white area, so I placed the shirt back on the rack and continued to add water. Once the dye has come through to the back side, I'm just going to leave the shirt alone a little while and give the dye a little bit of time to react with the fabric. I went ahead and zoomed the camera out so that you could see the entire container and how much water went through the shirt during the hot water irrigation process. I came back about 3 hours later and began to rinse the shirt. To rinse the shirt, I took it to my utility sink and I began rinsing it in cold water to rinse out the soda ash. Then I gradually warmed the water up to hot and continued rinsing to rinse out any of the excess dye that didn't bond with the shirt. After rinsing for a while, I went ahead and just decided to soak the shirt. I placed the shirt into my utility sink and added some hot water and a little bit of Dawn dish detergent. After the water cooled off, I changed it out and continued the soaking process until the water was almost clear. Then I put it into my washing machine and washed it on a hot water cycle along with a little bit of Dharma's textile detergent. Okay, so let's pick back up with our ice-dyed shirt. After the first layer of ice melted, I came back and added a second layer of ice because there was quite a bit of undissolved dye sitting on top of the shirt. After that second layer of ice melted, I gently lifted up the shirt to see whether or not the dye had come through to the back side. And it had done pretty well, but in a couple areas it was a little bit light and there was still quite a bit of dye sitting on top. So I went ahead and added a third layer of ice. So from this last photo, this is after the third layer of ice melted, and you can see about how much liquid was in the bottom of the container. So that can kind of give you a gauge as to how much water went through the shirt in comparison to the hot water irrigation shirt. I let the shirt process for at least 24 hours after that third layer of ice melted, so all total the shirt probably sat and processed about 48 hours. And I rinsed it and washed it the same way as I did the hot water irrigation shirt. So now that both of the shirts are washed and dried, let's have a look at them. I'm going to start with the hot water irrigation shirt. So the first thing that I notice is that the blueberry is not the color I thought it was going to be. This is the first time that I've used blueberry from Pro Chemical and Dye, and it is just a little bit different from the blueberry from Dharma. It kind of has more of a green tinge, I think. So it's not that it's a bad color, it's just not the color I was expecting it to be on this shirt. But as far as the hot water irrigation goes, I got really good color saturation. Both the front and the back don't have any large white areas. The lilac, which was right on the outside of the blueberry, didn't show up quite as well as I was expecting it to. It just kind of is blotchy. The same thing for the second band of orchid. It's a little bit blotchier than the first. The first bit of orchid that I used was right in the middle of the shirt. I did get good dye movement with the incline too, so I have pretty good dye streaks going through the shirt. As far as color splits, there aren't a lot of color splits in this shirt. There's a little bit right in between the grape and the royal purple, so a little bit in there where the ice blue is. And I'm not sure if that's so much color splits as if it's just where the colors mix right there in the middle. So overall, I like the shirt. I think it looks really pretty. But now let's look at the ice-dyed shirt. Okay, so it looks very different. I'm still not a fan of the blueberry. And the lilac, which is on the outside of that, it's a little blotchy on this shirt too. I did get quite a bit of color variation in the shirt though, which I really like. I like getting darker shades and lighter shades of the same color. That's one of the things that I like about ice dye, and I think that makes it look really interesting. The color saturation on this one is really good too, and we got really good dye movement. Okay, so now let's put the hot water irrigation up next to the ice dye and compare the two. Okay, so one of the first things that I notice is that the hot water irrigation gives more of a solid color, closer to the feel of a liquid dye. The ice dye is a lot blotchier, meaning it has a lot of color variations. You don't have just one solid color of grape and one solid color of orchid. It is varying shades and intensities of each of those colors, which I like. I like that varying shade and intensity. I did get some of that in the hot water irrigation, but not as much as I did in the ice dye. I think that the dye movement down the shirt from the incline was a lot more on the ice dyed shirt too. It seems to me like the streaks on the ice dyed shirt are a little bit more prominent and stand out more than they do on the hot water irrigation shirt. You can see the lines where the dye moved on both shirts, but they just stand out a lot more on the ice dyed shirt. The streaks themselves differ on the shirts. On the ice dyed shirt, all of the streaks are pretty much different widths and they vary quite a bit. Whereas on the hot water irrigation shirt, they all pretty much look the same. They're about the same width and everything. I also experimented with leaving the white lines between the colors, and I can't really tell a difference. I might be able to if I compared like putting the colors right up next to each other versus leaving a white line in between them, but just in this experiment, I truly couldn't tell if it made a difference or if it didn't. It's amazing how using all the same colors and just a little bit different method or technique of using those colors and dyes can yield such a different outcome. So I know which one I like the best, but what's your favorite? Drop me a comment down below and let me know which one is your favorite and if you have any comments about either one of these techniques. And if you've enjoyed this video, I sure would appreciate it if you would like it and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great day.